rather the only country in the world, is the only country in the world to have mandated a CSR obligation for private enterprises, which sort of outlines its role and relevance for the NGO sector in the country. In light of the pandemic, which we have just hopefully just sailed past, their role of NGOs will only increase in the country given their involvement in education, in livelihood support, in relief of the poor. Their role and relevance will only be increasing. I'll quickly set out the context. I'm sure because we are all practitioners, before we get down to some of the nuances, perhaps it may be best served to put out just the context out here. From a structure or a legal angle, not-for-profit organizations are set up as trust societies or Section 8 companies in the country. Upon registration with the tax authorities, historically, they were entitled to income tax and GST exemptions based on their activity. While this has historically been the case, for the most part, not-for-profit organizations, whenever they registered with the tax authorities, it was like a blanket registration forever. There have been gradual tweaks to the legislation over the last few years, especially from somewhere around 2016 onwards. Every year we have been seeing tweaks in every single budget on which is impacting not-for-profit organizations. Therefore, the question which really arises today is, what is the tax environment for NPOs, and is tax risk management for not-for-profit organizations at par with for-profit organizations? I would think it's not just at par, it's quite possible that it could be a shade higher because of the tweaks in the regulation and the downsides associated with claiming some of the exemptions in the tax law today, which is why we'll talk about the amendments in the laws. In terms of the context, again, in terms of what we are going to cover, we'll talk about the changing landscape for the taxation of charities under the Income Tax Act and the key amendments, particularly the amendments in the last 2 years, and what it really means for practitioners and for clients. Many of these are unprecedented changes, and we'll have to see as time passes by as to how the revenue and taxpayers really determine compliance with these regulations. And it'll be also interesting to see how courts and tribunals really interpret some of these changes, which are far-reaching. We'll also very quickly towards the end cover certain relevant areas such as FCRA, CSR, and some of the opportunities for NPOs in terms of what the government is thinking out. They're talking about social stock exchanges, etc., and what to really expect. As we go along, should you have any questions, please feel to put it out in the chat box, and my colleague Prasanna, who's with me, and I will try and respond to them, to the extent possible. In terms of the exemption, yes.
Mithun, sorry, just sorry, I missed making one mention at the start. I will just take a minute. Sorry. Sure. Guys, one more part is after this session from Mithun on NPOs, we will have Navneet brief on recent international tax developments for 10 minutes. We will do that after Mithun's session and after we finish the Q&A on Mithun's session. So please don't log off after Mithun's session. So there's one more snippet at the end which we're going to have. Thank you. Mithun, please continue after you. Sorry for this. Sorry, I missed this.
No problem. Right. In terms of income tax exemptions, which we were talking about, the key exemptions seem to be covered in Section 1023C, which has a large number of sub-clauses, and the provisions of Section 11 to 13, which is a more broader exemption. In terms of 1023C, a lot of the sub-clauses are very relevant for government-funded institutions. There are a few which are relevant for private enterprises or other private trusts such as universities, medical institutions, and as well as religious and charitable institutions, somewhere around 10, 23, 6, 6A, 5, etc. These historically had very few conditions, to be met compared to 12AA. Today, they are substantially similar to the 12AA registration or the 11 to 12, 11, 12, 13 exemptions. In terms of 12AA registration, it is relevant for charitable entities, and it is pretty wide, like we all know. The definition of charitable purpose covers relief of the poor, medical relief, education, yoga, advancement of any other object of general public utility, etc. Both sections require you to register with the authorities and apply at least 85% of your income for charitable activities or objects. Like I said earlier, over the last few years, the conditions for exemptions from 11 to 13 as well as 1023C, many new provisions or subclauses have been added in, like genuineness of activities, need for additional registrations, or other need for fresh registrations whenever there is modification of objects, etc. Again, in general, not-for-profit organizations can seek a registration under section 80G to give their donors an exemption. Again, in 80G, there are a few clauses which are relevant for private enterprises, such as 80G4 and 3F. The 80G4 is a 50% reduction, whereas 3F, which is relevant for universities and institutes of national eminence, which many of which are private, can go up to 100% reduction. Now, the tweaks in the law is something we will talk about in the next slide. And if you just see, in terms of the time chart over here, from 2016 to 2021, there have been, substantial changes to the income tax registration. I think the mother of all comes in 2016, which is a tax on accreted income of a not-for-profit organization, where an NPO can be charged to tax at the maximum marginal rate on the fair market value of its assets less liabilities in certain situations. So this amendment, although the field officers today are, to at least our knowledge, are not heavily enforcing, and we have seen perhaps a couple of decisions on this point as of now, substantially can impact the going concern of a not-for-profit organization if this were ever to trigger in your case. We'll talk about this, and probably the entire talk today will be structured around what are the various trigger points, or what are the live bombs which we'll be seeing around us, which we should try and avoid to avoid the trigger of the 2016 amendment. The 2017 to 21 amendments, in 2017 they brought out amendments that corpus donations by one charity will not be application of income in its hands. They brought out provisions saying that any change in objects require re-registration of the not-for-profit organization. Any modification of objects within 30 days, you need to go to the CIT exemptions and seek a fresh registrations. The power to survey not-for-profits was also introduced. In 18, the provisions of 40A, 40A1A, A3 and A3A, all relating to cash payments, as well as TDS on payments made by not-for-profit, which was typically applicable to those offering income under the head business and profession, were also made equally applicable to charity organizations. In 2019, amendment which was brought in was that the tax authority could cancel your registration if there was material non-compliance with any law which is necessary for fulfilling the objects of the trust. We'll talk about this and the 16th amendment a little more in detail, but in terms of the timeline, one would appreciate, where we are today in terms of these amendments. And I think the 20 and 21 amendments as well, there's a change in the registration process of charitable trusts, and the income tax utility for registration has been up and running for some time. One can go and seek a registration right away. So that's at 2021, and in the last budget of 21, large number of changes were also made relating to taxation of corpus donations, the manner of computing, application of income when you take a loan and apply it. They made changes relating to excess application of past years, or rather excess of expense over income, which was typically carried forward. Those changes were made. I'm quickly running through it because I'm talking about that a little more in detail. Now, when you look at this in the last half a decade, there have been so many changes that any ammunition given to the tax authority to withdraw or cancel your registration can trigger an exit tax in your case, right? And we'll move into exit tax, which is the provision in 115 TD. And as you see on the screen, lots of amendments have been brought in, but this one really is the most lethal one. It's in 115 TD and brought in by the Finance Act 2016, effective June 1, 2016. Now, in the past, when there was a cancellation of a 12AA registration, future tax benefits to the charitable organization were not available. There was no further implication other than the fact that the entity would have had to pay tax as they went forward. But effective June 2016, the laws have changed, and what the law today states is that in case your 12AA or AB registration is cancelled, or in case any registration when you modify your objects has been rejected, then in these two cases, the tax authority can cancel your registration when you're running. There are two other instances. They talk about merger with an entity which does not have similar objects as yourself, or at the time of dissolution, if you fail to transfer your assets to another 12AA or 12AB entity within 12 months. In those circumstances as well, the provision of 115 TD can really apply. So 2 when you're running and 2 when you are closing down. Now what it means is that the accreted income of the trust is subject to tax at maximum marginal rate, which is nearly 43%. And the manner of computing accreted income is also quite lethal. It takes into account fair market value of all assets of the organization. In case of immovable properties, it would take stamp duty valuation. In case of any other case, it would take the open market valuations and reduce liabilities of the organization and apply a 43% tax. Now, think about any of your clients. Think about any religious organization, having large land parcels, having a lot of donations which have been given to the trust over decades. Should there be any trouble on the income tax exemption side, and if there is a cancellation of registration, can you imagine the impact it will have on the NGO in particular and the society in general, because it would have to really sell all its assets to pay such a high tax. And the way the provisions have been written today, there seem to be even the person in charge, the principal officers in charge, could be also liable and could be viewed as assessees in default under this provision. Why is this more important is that from 2016 onwards, lots of powers were given to the tax authorities to revoke a registration, to cancel registrations in various circumstances, all of which have an impact under 115 TD, which is why this becomes very material. So another exemption which was, or rather another provision which was brought in, which talks about cancellation of registration, I think was a 2018 one. It talks about non-compliance with laws material for the purpose of achieving its objects. It's in 12 AB, in 1B and 5B. At the time of renewal of your registration, the tax authority is empowered to, in addition to check genuineness of the trust or institution, he's empowered to check on the compliance of requirements of laws which are material for fulfillment of your objects. Now, the first question which arises here is, is the tax officer the right person or having the right skill sets to determine compliance with material laws? Now, there are two circumstances. One is when you go for a fresh registration and, subsequent to passing an order for granting the registration, the tax authority can at any time seek to invoke this provision if there is any order from an authority, if there's any order, direction, or decree from any authority holding that the non-compliance has occurred and that dispute has attained finality. So at the time of fresh registration, it is in the opinion of the officer, it appears, but after you have got your registration, it depends on whether you have an order which is holding that you are not compliant. So take, for example, educational institutions. There are fee fixation committees all over the country. I'm just giving you a simple example. Many of the fee fixation committees come out with fees which should be which should be charged by private enterprises in different states. These come under state laws. And assume for a moment that a fee fixation committee comes up with an atrociously low fee for a school which is providing very high-ended education. If you do not follow that, if the tax authority believes that fees charged to students who come for education to your institution is material for the objects of the institution, it is not unlikely for the officer to consider revoking your exemption, and you will not just have an issue from the fee fixation committee, but you'll probably have an issue even with fighting out your income tax claim and exemption if the 43% tax applies. So there could be various other situations on how an NGO can get trapped with some of these with these provisions, which is why I think the risk management of NGOs will have to be top class and at par probably with for-profits. Let me just walk through some of the more recent changes now in light of 115 TD, and very quickly go through, and I'll just focus on issues because I think the law everybody is familiar with, but some of the practical aspects after the income tax websites have permitted NGOs to seek fresh registrations, etc. We'll focus on that. So currently speaking, every NGO is required to seek, whoever has got a 1023C or a 12AA registration is required to seek a fresh registration with the tax authority. The objective of this, what we understand from tax authorities, is that many of the NGOs were running for decades with a very, very old registration, which was given perpetually at that point in time, and they wanted, to have some sort of a database of who is operating, where are the documents, etc. So the plan is that the tax authority will 100% give you a registration right now. There's no question of not granting the registration, but you'll also get a unique registration number, and this registration will be valid for the next 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, there's a time prescribed 6 months prior to the completion of these 5 years. One needs to approach the authorities for an update of its registration. And similarly, for new not-for-profit organizations, one needs to apply for it 1 month from the end of before the end of the financial year for which you want to seek a registration. And this is contained in the new provision 12AB of the law. A change which has been brought in is that you can have opt for only one registration, which is either 12AB or 1023C. And in the past, many organizations had both registrations, but now you will have to opt for one over the other. There's a provision, section 11.7, which talks about this, that you can opt for only one. So a key question which may be posed before us is which is a better provision to go under, and what makes more sense for an organization. And this choice will have to be exercised before 31st of March 2022. And while you can move from a 1023C to a 12AA or 12AB registration, you can't do vice versa. So some of this one would need to take care of. So the question really arises, which one would be more beneficial? I think between 1023C and 12AB, I think 1023C is much narrower, but the draconian provisions of 115 TD do not apply. Therefore, to that extent, if you are able to completely cover yourself under 1023C, at least in case there is a problem on the exemption front in the future, you would be in a better position. It is narrower in scope, and you can see the more recent Supreme Court decisions. I think the last few months there have been a few decisions. There was of a medical institution which gave some sort of incentives to doctors who are also members of the society. And under 1023C, there is a provision which says that you have to be solely for the purpose of education or solely for the purpose of medical relief, and not for the purpose of profit. The Supreme Court has taken a view in this case that this provision was not complied by the medical institution, and has gone on to uphold the tax authority's position of withdrawing the exemption. Therefore, the definition, all of these in 1023C talk about solely existing for your object, and all your objects have to be in line with education or medical relief, as the case may be. So if you're having wide objects, then you may not really technically fall precisely in 1023C. So one needs to be careful in determining which one is over the other. While 1023C is quite narrow, it shields you against 115 TD for the moment. Question also arises is, does non-filing of the application within prescribed time limit leads to deemed cancellation of the registration? I think here, it's a tough call to say. One could look at the decision in the Tata case, which was brought out by the Mumbai Tribunal in March of 2021. In that case, the Tatas had one of their trusts was holding shares in one of the listed companies, and in 2015 they decided to voluntarily revoke the registration and wrote to the tax authorities that we do not want to claim 12AB in the future or 12AA in the future. The tax authorities did not respond to it, and in 2018 or so wrote back to the trust saying that we accept your voluntary revocation, but please pay taxes under 115 TD. This went to the Mumbai Tribunal, and the tribunal has upheld the taxpayers' claim that they should not be subject to 115 TD tax because they had voluntarily revoked before 2016, and they have upheld that claim. Perhaps some principles can be borrowed from this, saying that there is no question of cancellation by the authority, but me not voluntarily revoking a registration should stand on a different footing. But this could be extremely litigative, and one might be very careful in taking such calls. It also has impact from a CSR perspective. If you're not registered, you may not get CSR funding. The GST risks one should also look at. Some of the GST exemptions are linked to 12AB registrations. Moving on from a procedural aspect, the entire process is electronic, and anybody seeking fresh registrations or renewal of your registration is required to file Form 10A electronically. And the tax authority would give you a registration along with a unique registration number in Form 10AC. This is valid for the next 5 years. And in case of new institutions or new registrants, it's valid for the next 3 years alone. The registration, there are rules which have been prescribed, and Rule 17A6 and 2C talk about certain situations where the registration granted can be revoked. And now why are we keeping on harping on situations of revocation is because of 115TD again. So there have been certain situations which have been prescribed here, which talk where you do not provide information, provide false information, not providing all documents, etc. In such situations, the tax authority can revoke the registration and URN granted. And they've used some pretty different language here. It stated that in such a situation, the registration would deem to never have been granted or issued ever. So it doesn't use the word cancelled, but it talks about deemed to never have been granted or issued. So one could even contend, should you be in this situation, that my registration has not been, if it was never been granted or issued, where is the question of cancellation? So again, these are some things which somebody could urge in litigation, but the language provided in these different clauses doesn't provide highest level of comfort on these matters. Again, from the procedural side, the Form 10AC somehow seems to be which is provided by the tax authorities, which is the form of registration, contains certain language. It talks about how the tax authority can withdraw the order in different cases. They have the Form 10AC, which some of the orders which have come out already seem to suggest that any activity which is not genuine, applicant who has got registration by fraud, misrepresentation, which is all aspects one would expect the tax authority to withdraw registrations on. But they also contain certain language. For example, it says if the assessee has violated any condition prescribed in the act, then the order will be withdrawn. So what do you mean by violated any condition in the Income Tax Act? Does it mean if I violate a trivial condition, my registration would be withdrawn? What if I do not deduct tax, do not file my tax return on time? Can it be withdrawn? Again, the concept of withdrawal is not there in the Act. It talks about 115TD talks about cancellation, but the form here talks about withdrawal. And many questions come to mind. What is the meaning of withdrawal? Will exit tax be triggered? Is this withdrawal discretionary? Can you challenge it? I think these are some open points which we will have to debate as we go forward and we see more of these registrations. There is, some of the 10AC forms which have come out also contain a list of other conditions. We have seen some orders which have up to 18 conditions which are specified there. And some of them raise several questions. For example, it says some of the orders have said that if there is any amendment or alteration of objects, you require prior approval of the CIT. The Income Tax Act, on the other hand, says that any modification of the objects require approval of the CIT after 30 days of such modification. This talks about prior approval. There are situations which talk about maintaining separate accounts for each object of the trust, as well as letting the jurisdictional commissioner know about the bank accounts through which any public money is routed. So I think these raise many questions regarding how does one seek to comply with these conditions specified in the forms? Can a view be taken that I'm not getting into every single point here because there are several out here. Can a view be taken that the form or rule cannot override the act, as held by the Supreme Court in Tulsian case? And what are the remedies available to the taxpayer? Should the taxpayer appeal against such an order, not really against the registration, but against the conditions specified in the registration? Should you just wait for the commissioner to detect such a risk and at that time seek a decide to battle the matter? I think some of these points will which will come up in practice, and taxpayers will have to take a call on what does one need to do in these cases. Moving on, I think some of the more substantial amendments which were brought in was relating to corpus donations. And the object of this provision was that where a corpus donation was got under 11(1)(d) and similarly in 1023(c), the corpus donation was considered not to be income for the purposes of the charitable trust income definition. They have amended this provision. What used to happen is people used to give corpus donations, and with that money, the trust would expend this and claim this as an application of income, and therefore there was a matching or rather mismatch on income and expenses. So this provision has been plugged to avoid this sort of a mismatch. What it today says is that the corpus donation will have to be deployed only in 11(5) securities or 11(5) assets, not securities per se. And it should be maintained specifically for this purpose. And if it is at any time or rather the explanation 4 goes on to say that if this amount is utilized for any purpose, it will not be allowed as an application of income. So I think the key change would be that corpus donations will now need to be in 11(5) securities alone, 11(5) assets alone, sorry. And I think it is advisable or rather imperative in the law today for a separate bank account to be maintained to keep corpus donations, and the right accounting systems to follow this, the corpus donations. The application of income is something one needs to look at as well. So for instance, if you break a fixed deposit from a corpus donation and apply it for charitable purpose, what the law today says is that expenditure will not be treated as application of income. But when you replenish this fixed deposit tomorrow, you will claim this as an application of income. So one would need to look at this quite closely. Similar provisions have brought in so far as repayment of loans are concerned. This is really codifying a earlier CBDT circular. I think there was a CBDT circular of 1973, whose tenor has been now codified in the law. Essentially, what it says is that if a loan is taken by a trust and it is applied for charitable purposes, you will not seek application of income in the year in which you applied for charitable purposes, but in the year in which you pay back this loan. Several questions come up here. What happens to sundry creditors, etc. One would take a view that sundry creditors are not loan or borrowing. What happens to loans or borrowings in my books as of 31st of March 2021? Will this provision really apply? We don't think it should apply, but the tenor of the CBDT circular may still need to be followed in such cases. So these are the two changes on corpus donations and the repayment of loans. Another interesting provision which has been brought in is on the restrictions on carry forward and set off of excess application of past years. Now, in case of a charitable entity, the heads of income really do not apply. It's commercial principles basis which you determine your income. And therefore the carry forward provisions of 70, 71, 72, etc. were not applicable. But taxpayers in the past have, in instances where they have applied expenditure in excess of the income of the year, have sought to claim this expense as on commercial principles and have carried forward this in their tax return. Now, this position has been blessed by the Supreme Court in the case of Subros Educational Society, where SLP was rejected of the tax department on this matter. And therefore, that seems to have been plugged now. So question really is this prospective? What happens to my losses or excess applications as at 31st March? As of 31st March 2020, when I had a loss in my books, can somebody say that this is a vested right of a SSE which has been taken away? And therefore, at least to the extent of 31st March 2021 losses, can I seek to carry those forward? It's a very technical position. There are positions in the past or other decisions from tribunals and high courts in the past. For example, when the provisions of long-term capital loss set-off were changed, and long-term capital loss was permitted to be set off only against long-term capital gains in the future. There have been cases where courts have upheld the vested right position of somebody who had already incurred a long-term capital loss in the past. And in the future, he was, even with the change in law, on the grounds that this was a vested right. At the time I incurred the loss, I had a right to set it off, and therefore that right cannot be taken away by future legislation. I think principles from those one could explore claiming on this aspect. It becomes relevant, especially when there are so many changes going on that you can't claim depreciation and capex as a deduction at the same time. You can't carry forward excess application of income. Corpus donations, there is a mismatch. Loans, there is a mismatch. So in these situations, there could be situations where you might want to explore making these claims to avoid any immediate payout of taxes. Right, I think there's a question which has come out. I think compliances of other laws. You gave one example of low fees. Will you please give some more examples? I think there may be, say for example, suppose you're running an old age home, and if there are any state or municipal laws over there as to how you should run that old age home, or for example, if there's a medical, suppose you have a hospital and you're not maintaining some standards prescribed by local authorities, or say for example, a UGC comes after your college because the norms and standards prescribed under certain laws have not been followed. There can be several of them. Now the question really is, are these material to achieving your objects? Now it will be up to the SEC to prove that these are either not material to achieving the objects, or that challenge the provision itself. So I think in case of not-for-profits, wherever there are regulations under which you are covered under, for example, educational institutions, the AICTE, UGC comes out with norms and standards. In case of private universities, there are State Private Universities Act under which these come under. Now, in case of medical institutions, there could be R&D provisions. There could be, codes prescribed for doctors, etc. So you don't know where you could, walk into a problem. The question is, what is material for your objects? Now, in my example, is charging of fees to students a material aspect for running an education institution? That becomes a legal point, which becomes, a tussle between taxpayer and the tax authority, and which is why, the point about compliance with regulations, one needs to be careful of. I hope that answered your question.
Mithun, one more
Sure.
example could be FCRA violations by the NPO.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That could be a showstopper as well, which the department could pounce on, so to say, to trigger cancellation or so-called withdrawal.
Yes.
Would that be a good reason as well?
It's possible, but one could say that, FCRA, is talking about raising donations from different sources. That is not my object is not to raise donation. Maybe one of the objects is to apply the donation for charitable purposes. Object is to raise and apply it. But I think, with the government stance on FCRA, it's possible that the tax authority may challenge you, but I think your defense would be more that my object is not to raise donations. My object is really relief of the poor, to really apply those donations. I think that may be something which you might want to urge before the tax authority.
Fair enough. Thank you.
No, other laws, that question was from that perspective only. Is it that broad enough that any violation of law can lead to the consequence? Or as you rightly said, which affects the object of the trust, only those cases are to be seen. And are there any precedent on this aspect?
Right. So there is no precedent at the moment, because I think this was made in 2018. And it has not yet seen, not yet come up the hierarchy, but these are fertile areas for litigation of tomorrow, and one would need to really advise your clients. Now it is more of litigation prevention. To most of the not-for-profits today, at least, don't have solid risk management policies. Very often large institutions as well have very small legal and accounting departments, and you don't know what's going on. We could have a public interest litigation from a parent that, education quality is poor, or that the promoters are making money on the side. Anything can happen today, especially when you're dealing with public. So I think the short point there, sir, is about having good risk management in these cases. That it's important to challenge these decisions. At least have to know, which are material for your object. At least those, to be very, very close to be monitored very closely, because of the income tax implication of this.
Right. One common question comes, as you rightly said, in case of charitable trust, income is to be computed on the basis of commercial principles. Then a question asked is, then in ITR 7 form, then how those the heads of income are there, and when to use those heads of income in the ITR? When we say income,
Right.
yeah, you got my question.
No, got it. I think there one would, typically look at, can you put it under income from other sources? Because of that provision. But I think in case of capital gain, you have 11(1)(a), which talks about capital gain, but it talks about its special method of computing under 11(1)(a). So I think there have also been decisions on this matter saying that provisions of 45 onwards and 50C, etc., will not apply when you compute capital gain. But it's a fair point. I think that's a practical aspect on disclosure. I think, in case of capital gain and house property, you could even consider putting it in there, knowing fully well that the position is under a separate code.
No, if you compute on commercial principle, this is the receipt, these are the 15%, this is 85%, then you cannot fill up on the basis of heads of income.
Correct.
Practically.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right.
Okay, you can proceed, then we can take question. Yeah.
Sure. Right. So very quickly, I think we have a few minutes left. I think there's a question on, there's this point on increase in annual receipts of small trusts. 1023C3 AD and AE have been amended, and the point really is the income of the trust has moved from earlier it used to be 1 crore, it's moved to 5 crores, and it's applicable on the aggregate income of the trust. Earlier there was dispute, bunch of decisions, Jat Education Society, etc., where courts have held that you need to apply this provision per institution and not at the overall trust level. It was to overcome these exemptions. Another topical area is on what you typically see. If a not-for-profit organization is making payments to the trustees or shareholders or any organization in which they hold substantial interest, I think this is a pretty common question for practitioners. Can I do it, and what are the things to take care of? I think subject to what the the law under which you're covering under. For example, if your trust deed has if the trust deed has any restrictions on this matter, then it's a different matter. But per se, from an income tax perspective, at least if any payment has been made, one should look at 2 or 3 aspects. One, clearly the payment should be reasonable, and one should apply some sort of reasonability test to see how you can defend the reasonability of these transactions. There are a bunch of decisions on this matter, Kirek Education, Kamdar Education, etc., where they have looked at comparable uncontrollable prices. What did the for-profit enterprise charge other parties? Was the trust seeking similar services from other for-profit enterprises, etc., in determining reasonability of these transactions? Now, the second and third point really is on the legal form, or rather the contracts which are entered into between parties. Very often we see 1 or 2 pagers, which is very basic documentation which is put together. I think there one has to take a lot of care to make sure that the documentation is at par with what you would have contracted with unrelated parties. There is certain decisions, I think Z-Learn, etc., where the tribunals have spoken about sort of on documentation side. The third piece really is the substance of the transaction. Are you really providing the service which you are specifying? The actual conduct of the parties, it's essentially the transfer pricing principles. Are you really providing the services? Do you have the right skill sets? Do you have the right people? Do you have the right assets? I think these are the 3 points which one should look at very carefully when you have transactions between the trust and corporate vehicle, because here this is another fertile area for litigation and for you to potentially lose exemptions in case any of this is being challenged to trigger 115TD. So the key takeaways, put in place processes to comply with the latest tax amendments. Review your existing MOUs, activities of the NPOs. Do you require fresh registrations in any case? Important point is to review compliances with material laws to achieve the NPO objects. In case of related party transactions, have related party reasonability documentation. I think these are some of the areas which one should really talk to your clients about, because the downsides today of having NPOs registration revoked is very large, like what we spoke about earlier. I have a few points on FCRA, etc., but I think they are a little dated. So I'm happy to take any questions. We can stop for the moment and given that 615 is the outer limit. Bharat, if that is okay, I have a few slides on certain other matters. I can stop here if you would like. We can just quickly run through them either way it works.
We have one question, Mithun. Maybe if you can just take the questions, or would you? How long would you take with the additional slides? A few five minutes, maybe.
Yes, maximum
Yeah.
5 maybe.
Yeah. Then maybe you can run through the slides, and then we'll take up the questions which are there in the Q&A box.
Sure. All right, sounds good. Okay, so I think on the certain other areas, I think from the FCRA piece, these are all slightly dated provisions, but transfer from one trust to another is now completely prohibited. Earlier, one could transfer between two FCRA registered entities. There is a cap on administrative expenses, which this has been lowered from 50 to 20% now. Now, in case of large international charities, which is to pay very high salaries to some of their top employees, etc., would be impacted by this. So, what is the definition of salaries? Of administrative expenses is something we will have to look at. I think over the last 1 year, one has to open a account with SBI for receipt of foreign contribution, which has to be routed through New Delhi, through a New Delhi branch of State Bank of India. These are some of the changes. In addition to this, we have seen a lot of action for non-compliance with the FCRA regime, and that is something which is ongoing. On the CSR side, very quickly, company law rules have been amended. Very quickly speaking on this, requires mandatory registration. There are points on administrative overheads not being more than 5% of the CSR spend. Any assets which you acquire has to be in the name of the beneficiary and not in your own name. Some beneficial provisions like carry forward and set off of excess CSR spends is also possible now for the next 3 years. Also provisions on treatment of unspent CSR, which needs to be deposited with certain government funds. These are some of those changes which may be relevant. I'm sure these are some of the changes which have been brought in. And probably the last one before I wind up is, I think in the budget of 2019, the finance minister had talked about having electronic fundraising platforms called as a social stock exchange. The objective was to list social enterprises and voluntary organizations and support them in fundraise. Now, SEBI expert panel has come out with a technical report on this in May of 2021, and a white paper was issued earlier. These are all reports which are in the public domain right now. Essentially, what they're talking about is, can we move towards a situation where impact capital can come into these not-for-profit organizations? Can we have social bonds, that is zero coupon, zero principal bonds, which are listed, which can be listed on the social stock exchange, which people can buy and don't get any return on this? They are also talking about certain structures. Today we have social venture funds and mutual funds as well. In certain, you have the HDFC Cancer Fund, where you will get only a nominal return, but the excess delta created here is going towards cancer research and for cancer patients. We have social venture funds, which is permitted form of a Cat 1 AIF under SEBI law today. Today, most of the SEBI social venture funds are for-profit enterprises itself, but investing impact capital in impact areas. But they want to promote grant and aid by these funds, which is also permitted today in the law. They're talking about common minimum reporting standard for social impact, governance, and financials. And also pay for success social impact bonds. Essentially, if you as a not-for-profit, these are all things which are still in the works, but essentially from what we understand is that a bond would be issued, which will be subscribed by an investor. And in case the charity has been successful on its project, then there will be either underwriters or third parties who will pay the investor who took a risk on this project a higher return. So what happens is the risk on the project would be taken by an investor who will lose his money in case the project doesn't work well. But this is a different animal, different type of an investor. People who are not only looking at alphas and returns, but want to have an impact of their money in the social sector, which we see quite a bit in the West, with a lot of impact funds doing so well today. I think it's in light of all of this that the government is also working towards a separate a regime, so to say, for not-for-profits to access capital. And if and when, I think the intention is very clear. The question is as to when will it come and how practical it would be. Once it comes out, I think it would be good both for not-for-profit organizations to raise capital, and it will be a new form of practice for our tax consultants as well. So I think we should keep our eyes open for this. A few questions. I think whether 115TD will apply to a trust registered under 1023C6. Answer is no. Today the provisions do not contain this. Or whether it is only registered under 12A registered trust. I think Rakesh's question. I think 1023C is not covered under 115TD as of now. Can the trustee receive remuneration from the trust? I think this is a very tricky question. I think if the trustee performs services beyond that of a trustee, for example, if he's the vice chancellor of the university or is a principal of the college, etc., then it becomes a lot more possible. Again, technically, is something prohibiting the trustee from charging a remuneration? I don't think there's anything prohibiting, because you have a lot of trustees in the for-profit world, a lot of banks, financial institutions, etc., who take remuneration. So, but I would think that if you want to, in case the question is about, taking a reasonable payment out, then I think, services beyond that of a trustee, where a person has provided a lot of value, is where, you could potentially look at, and reasonability is something which will have to be maintained. Yeah, I think 1023C registered trusts are not eligible for registration as CSR trusts, only 12A. That is correct at the moment. I don't think there's any change over there. One will have to look at, I think representations are made on this front for 12AA changes. Again, a question, a Supreme Court in case of Ashwini Rugnalya, I think we touched on this, held a hospital enjoying exemption cannot charge same rate as other commercial hospitals. Only medical relief by itself is sufficient for claiming 1023C. The medical services have to be rendered on philanthropic basis. How should a hospital ring fence itself from adverse implication arising out of this ruling? I think the ruling is not on charging, charging similar to commercial hospitals. I think if you look at the Supreme Court ruling very, very closely, it was talking about inpatient services and outpatient services. And somewhere it goes on to say that, I think the Supreme Court makes some statement to the extent that, if it was only charging a higher fee, it is okay. But it goes on to say that some of the doctors who are also members and directors of the society were getting paid a sort of a 20 or 30% sort of a revenue share for inpatient services, which is why it finally held that they did not want to alter with the High Court provision. So I don't think it is on how I don't think it impacts charging of fees by hospitals to patients as much as it impacts doctors taking their fees out of the medical institution. Again, this is 1023C. The language used in 1023C is solely for the purpose of medical relief and not for the purpose of profit. This similar language is not there in 12AA solely and not for the purpose of profit, etc. Therefore, I would think the Ashwini Sahakari Rugnalaya ruling, one would need to still see it in the proper light of 1023C. And I think this ruling, there's also on the Visvesvaraya Technical University, on solely for educational purposes and substantially funded by the central and state government. Again, all these are under 1023C. Therefore, in terms of exercising a choice between 1023C and 12AA, I think some of these rulings would show us the light in determining which side to go on.
In case of this renewal of charitable trust, that form which is to be done now, which is postponed till, there was a question in the form whether your trust is irrevocable. And many of the speakers in various seminars have said that if you write no, then the registration will not be granted. But practically, I found that though there is no clause in the trust deed, whether it is revocable or not, then we have written no and they have granted the registration. Because in my view, charitable trust in its nature only, it is irrevocable. What do you say on that?
No, I completely agree with that, because once you pay something to a trustee to hold it for charitable purposes, to that extent you can't take the money back because you are not a beneficiary. Beneficiary is the public, right? Yeah. I think in that case, maybe good to pass a board trustee resolution to the effect that even today, stating the intention, although the intention will need to be seen at the time the settler settled the trust. But you might, as trustees today, bring this abundantly clear that it is irrevocable. Completely agree with you that by the very concept, with you not being excluded as a beneficiary and the public being beneficiary, the moment you have transferred it to the trust, it could become, it is really an irrevocable trust. I think in the past, there used to be a law or rather these provisions used to talk about partially for charitable and partially not for charitable, but I'm not wholly familiar with this. I think that is something which is in decades ago. So perhaps principles from that could also be used in taking a position. But again, on revocability versus irrevocability, I think it would be wise to say that it is clearly irrevocable on these grounds.
A charitable trust running a hospital, or say eye hospital, and running a spectacle shop or a pharmacy, will you say that it is incidental to the object, or yes, you advise that better they keep separate books of account and go under 11(4)(a)?
Right. I think the Tanti Trust case is quite clear on that from the Supreme Court 247 ITR on what is incidental to the objects. But I think while Tanti Trust can be interpreted very widely to say that as long as the profits of the business are used for the objects of the trust, then it is incidental. As long as I would think that in case the activity which you are undertaking is in line with the objects, for example, in case of a pharmacy, etc., it is still related to medical relief. But if you're an educational institution running a printing press, then I think you would want to look at 11(4)(a). So I think the decision point there is whether the activity which you are running, how close is it to the objects of the trust in determining 11(4)(a) versus and maintaining separate books of account, versus this thing. But I think conservatively, if you maintain separate books of account as well, you may not be in a worse off situation.
Yes. Only one more.
Yes, sir.
this educational institution getting salary grant.
Mhm.
See, that salary grant, the department's contention is, and there are various case laws on that, in the assessing officer stage, that 15% will not be allowed because you have to spend 100% of the salary grant. So that 15% standard deduction type will not be allowed to you. You have come across anything on that?
Well, I think that's not there in the, and it's not there in the provision in the law. I mean, the question really would be that, if somebody gives you a grant with a specific purpose to utilize for a particular purpose, then would you say that the 15% provision will not apply? That is a question. I could give a grant to a school to say you run for annual day expenses with a specific direction that it only applies for annual day purposes. Then does it mean that 15% should not be applicable in this case? I think the answer would be no. So I think that may be that is something which we might want to challenge. Right. And I think there have been decisions in the past as well where even a specific direction granted in a letter saying utilize for a particular purpose, they have been held to be corpus donations and not even considered to be income. So although now in 11(1)(d), with all these changes, you are in a different situation. I think I think that position of the assessing officer, I think that is not stemming from the act, at least can be challenged.
This corpus donation, as you rightly said, now the amendment is there that you have to keep in 11(5) asset. That is okay. But many speakers in various seminars have advised that you open a separate bank account. In my view, even if you in the same bank account, existing bank account, if you earmark separately, that should suffice.
Right. I think that is.
Does it apply to?
Sorry, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah, please.
Right. So I think on that, I think the language use is maintained specifically for this purpose. I think versus general versus specific bank account, I think we are better off with having a separate bank account. Mixing this together may not meet the conditions of maintained specifically for the purpose of corpus. And therefore, I think you might be better off maintaining this in a separate bank account.
No, or I say in existing bank account, you can earmark this is the corpus donation received and this FD is kept for that. Will it not suffice?
Yeah, I think if it's kept as a fixed deposit, you'll be okay, sir. So if it comes into your bank account and then you move it into a fixed deposit, which is specifically maintained for corpus, I think that should be okay, as long as accounting is also clear on this matter.
Okay. And it applies to the corpus donation received hereinafter, no, in this year.
Yes,
or even
correct.
For the past also.
No, it's not. Should not be for the past. It should be prospective.
Correct. Thank you. Yes, Bharat, you can move.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for that, for those fantastic insights. Like you mentioned, 115 TD, that chapter is riddled with so many finer issues. I think as tax litigators, all of us will have a field day in making a case before the AO, thereafter the CIT appeals. And for all you know, we should wait and watch for how the department reads those complexly worded provisions and taxpayers take them to the writ courts. So I think we're headed for interesting times. Thank you so much, Mithun. Sharmaji, I leave it to you for the vote of thanks. After that, we will pull in Navneet, who's waiting there, and he can resume. Sharmaji, off to you.
Okay. Yeah, right. Thank you. As Mr. Mithun sir said, government is very uncharitable towards charitable trust in making the amendment. Friends, however, you will all agree with me that Mr. Mithun was very charitable in discussing various amendments, mostly all the latest amendments in case of non-profit organization. Thank you, Mr. Mithun, for sparing your valuable time and by imparting the knowledge to us. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Bharat. Hello.
Thank you, Sharmaji. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sure, Mithun, you can drop off. Thank you so much. Prasanna, thank you as well.
Thank you all.
Again, guys, now we have Navneet this side who will share with us a few quick snippets from an international tax standpoint. So Navneet is again a person who comes up with very interesting ideas whenever I speak to him on income tax matters. Although our discussions are primarily domestic, his specialization is across jurisdictions, and he extensively works with multinationals in their tax matters around the world. Navneet has been here for more than 15 years, and he articled and spent considerable time with a leading Big Four organization. Thereafter, he went on to head the tax function of a very large Bangalore-based multinational, Indian multinational. And today he's practicing in Bangalore with a practice which spans from Navneet, correct me if I'm wrong, with the tax returns to tax compliances in overseas jurisdictions, not only in India. So that's where I would want to dip into Navneet's experience to share some of the recent international tax developments. Navneet, off to you. Navneet, can you share your screen if you have any slides ready? Do you have access?
I do.
Super. Yeah, we can see you, we can hear you, we can see the screen as well. I'll switch off this side, Navneet.
Thank you, Bharat, for those flattering words. It's actually a slightly unenviable task to be speaking at this point. And I say that because it's Friday evening past 6:30. And speaking after Mithun, who is just so articulate and eloquent and has spoken on such an interesting topic, it'll be like attempting to bat after Sachin Tendulkar. Not a very enviable position I am in, but having said that, I will make an honest attempt at this experiment of sorts which Bharat wanted me to undertake in a era where you are seeing an increasing role of a tax professional having interlock with overseas countries, overseas tax laws. We are seeing you will increasingly be noticing Indian MNCs going outbound and Indian professionals starting to take on roles which spans and overseas tax laws across geographies. We thought it may be useful to try and bring certain updates on what is happening across the world and see if these are opportunities that you, if you're working with a company that has a presence in some of these geographies, could look at it as an opportunity. If you're working with a company which has a presence in that country, that's an opportunity. Else, it could be an opportunity for you to take it to your clients and say, here, these are certain developments that may be of interest. There are a few things that we'd like to hear from you as we go along. This is the first session, and like I said, an experiment of sorts. We'll have to see how to balance this, because the set of developments that happen are fairly vast. Even if it is once a month, there is just so many changes that happen across the world. One will have to try and balance the coverage with the amount of depth, because once you start looking at a significant amount of detail, one may not be able to cover the span of all the changes. Having said that, I've tried to balance the requirement in terms of what is that I have noticed over the last few weeks, and try to bring that to you as a part of a possible 10 to 15 minute snapshot. With that context in mind, I will go over to what I have to say. I have certain updates from Malaysia, Netherlands, certain development in the EU front and how it impacts Hong Kong and how Hong Kong is changing its laws. what is an opportunity in China, a certain update in Singapore, perspective on digital tax in terms of how multiple countries are trying to implement this in light of the inclusive framework. Some statements and comments, you would be seeing multiple comments from people across Europe and certain developed geographies. A certain contra thought or a slightly differentiated perspective from a couple of places is again what I wanted to highlight. And at the end, certain quick updates on tax rate changes that I have noticed. Are you able to see the screen so that Bharat, before I proceed?
Yes, we can see the screen. Please proceed.
You may all be familiar with a favorable tax regime and how popular a jurisdiction Singapore is. It's always had fairly attractive and interesting tax incentive regimes. You will also have noticed that there are Me Too companies or countries which tend to follow the set of incentive schemes that Singapore has offered. What I've noticed is that Malaysia tends to follow or has had incentive schemes which are not very, very different, or rather on some amount or a reasonable amount of similarity with what Singapore has had. Singapore is fairly popular for a global trader program, as well as having an incentive regime in the form of a headquarter regime, international headquarters and a regional headquarter regime. All these programs provide companies which opt for meet these requirements, the set of guidelines that are prescribed, fairly attractive and a competitive tax rate. Malaysia has also had similar programs. Singapore and Malaysia tweaked their programs to align with PEPS and the set of recommendations that, or the set of changes that it had to ensure that these are not treated as harmful tax practices. And thereafter, Malaysia brought in something called a Principal Hub Incentive 2.0. This was possibly a while back, maybe a couple of years back. It has been tweaking this program, and recently there were a couple of tweaks to the Principal Hub 2.0, and it has very recently introduced Principal Hub Program 3.0, and it has also introduced something called a Global Trading Center Incentive. Now, what is this program and what is the incentive? This is actually a snapshot from the scheme itself or from the guideline itself. Assuming certain conditions are met, a company which sets up, if a new company is set up in Malaysia and meets certain conditions around employment, around operating expenses, around undertaking certain qualifying services, and serving or meeting a certain net of servicing a certain number of group entities or network companies, and using certain local services. In other words, there are a bunch of conditions that need to be satisfied. If these conditions are satisfied, there is either a 0% rate or a 5% tax rate for a period of 10 years in 2 blocks of 5 years. That is, you meet the conditions for a period of 5 years, you get a 0 and a 5% tax rate. You meet a certain level of enhanced conditions thereafter, you can continue to avail and enjoy the beneficial tax rate. These conditions involve employing a certain number of people. They also specify that these employment or these employees have to have a certain amount of monthly salary. They call them high value jobs. And further, even in that, they have a couple of conditions. They say a certain number of high value jobs where, let's say, people with 5,000 RM, Malaysian ringgit per month, and a certain number of people with 25,000 Malaysian ringgit as payout. Assuming these conditions are met, like employment, you have a certain threshold for operating expenses, etc., etc., you will be able to enjoy this beneficial tax rate. Now, this benefit of 0 and 5% is available for new entities that are being set up. for an existing entity, subject to satisfying similar conditions and a couple of other conditions, they could claim a beneficial tax rate of 10%. I am not going into the details at the moment and the nuances. The scheme is available. It's a reader-friendly scheme. It's available on the MIDAS website. And I can also share the link at the end of the discussion. You can run through the scheme. If you have a company which could possibly avail this incentive, is looking at scaling up operations in Malaysia, these are two programs that are worth exploring. There is also a global trader program that requires the company in Malaysia to be undertaking certain activities in relation to sourcing, strategic sourcing, procurement, distribution of raw materials and components, and finished products. So if you're doing these activities and you have a sales turnover of Malaysian ringgit 300 million and a couple of other conditions, the company may be able to claim a concessionary tax rate of 10%. There are certain conditions attached. It must be in a licensed manufacturing warehouse or a free zone or a bonded warehouse. Assuming these conditions are satisfied, one can also look at this global trader program as an incentive. Netherlands, most countries introduced provisions similar to 94B, limiting interest deduction. This was set at 30% of EBITDA. There was a safe harbor in Netherlands. Netherlands also used a similar approach of setting interest limitation at 30% of EBITDA with a safe harbor of 1 million euro, which would mean up to this amount of 1 million, you don't have to satisfy and meet the 30% EBITDA condition. Without, you will still be able to claim the deduction. Now it is proposed to move that threshold from 30% to 20%. The law is proposed to be amended effective 1st of January 22. However, the threshold of 1 million continues to remain the same. In addition, the proposed change seeks to bring in anti-fragmentation rules to ensure that the 1 million is not broken down between multiple group companies, to ensure that the interest payout is less than $1 million, but to various group entities. To avoid and overcome that scenario, certain anti-fragmentation rules are also sought to be introduced. Another interesting change is the change to the blacklist and the grey list by the EU. EU lists out certain countries as in the blacklist and certain countries in its grey list. The countries which are in the blacklist may have certain defense mechanisms or anti-avoidance mechanism introduced by EU member countries. If on the other hand, there are certain harmful practices that each of these domestic tax laws have, and the country says, I will make certain changes to this requirement, they are in the grey list. Hong Kong, because of the territorial system of taxation that it follows, has now been included in the grey list. What is interesting is the fact that certain changes are proposed to the Hong Kong tax law, and why it is important. Hong Kong, like Singapore, is a significant player and is used substantially in planning cross-border affairs, especially in the APAC region. A lot of people work with the territorial system of taxation that Hong Kong adopts. I've extracted this announcement by the Hong Kong revenue or Hong Kong SAR, which is worth spending a few seconds on. Under the premise of supporting and combating cross-border tax evasion, the Hong Kong SAR government agrees to cooperate with and has committed to the EU to amend the Inland Revenue Ordinance. Hong Kong will continue to adopt the territorial system as a territorial source principle of taxation. The proposed legislative amendments will merely target corporations, particularly those with no substantial economic activity in Hong Kong, that make use of passive income to evade tax across a border. That's an interesting proposition. And if you're working with groups who have a substantial Hong Kong presence, it may be worth taking note of this development and seeing what needs to be done. One will also have to wait and watch how the revenue seeks to tweak its law, and thereafter see what is the correction that may be required from the group's perspective to ensure this is not a significant setback. China has a deferral scheme for tax deferral scheme for small and medium companies. These may be useful for entities which have a cash flow challenge. The corporate income tax and VAT and other tax payments could be deferred up to 3 months. There's a 100% deferral for small companies and a 50% deferral for medium-sized companies. Small company would be one which has a sales of less than 20 million RMB, and medium companies would be ones which have a sales of less than 400 million RMB. Another point or aspect which may be good to know is that Singapore periodically provides guidance on tax treaties. It has a guidance like it has guidance on multiple areas. It also has a position paper or guidance on how to interpret tax treaties. There is an updated material on this issue. What is worth reading is the set of updates around the mandatory and binding tax arbitration. Some quick thoughts around digital service tax. This is something that you would keep seeing in the press, what is also called as equalization levy in India, and subject matter of and leading to the Pillar 1 introduction. I just wanted to highlight how multiple countries are viewing developments and how are they tackling and what are they doing vis-a-vis the Pillar 1 that is being introduced. Canada has gone ahead with a legislation to introduce digital service tax effective 1st of Jan 2022. The difference is that they would not levy this, they would defer the implementation or the levy to 2024, with the condition that if the multilateral condition on Pillar 1 does not come into force by 31st of December 2023, they would levy this DST on the revenues earned from 1st of Jan 2022. I thought that's an interesting approach that Canada has adopted. A while back, you may remember that US had introduced additional tariffs on multiple countries. This tariff was suspended for a period of 6 months. That 6-month period is likely to end by end of this month. US has thereafter entered into an agreement with 5 European countries, pursuant to which this tariff may not be applicable. How does this impact India? Before we get into that, some quick thoughts in terms of what I have noticed. And I'm happy to hear from you on any additional points and information which you may have from the revenue. Initially, I noticed articles immediately after the OECD announcement that India is not going to withdraw any of these measures. Thereafter, I've seen a statement which clarified that India will withdraw this after the introduction of the drift of the statement was that we will continue to have this levy up to the point Pillar 1 is implemented. And at a later point, I've also seen news articles which suggest that Nirmala Sitharaman has confirmed that India will withdraw its digital tax. I would, from these information in public domain, draw the inference that India is likely to withdraw some of these levies, but only after the implementation of Pillar 1. Now, with this background and context, and assuming this to be true, how will US now tackle this tariff? Are they going to go ahead and implement additional tariffs on India? Or will there be an agreement like they have with the set of 5 other countries in Europe, etc.? Is something that I would think we have to wait and watch. inclusive framework, a couple of perspectives. One is an interesting statement by the economy minister of Argentina. It's just easier for me to read it out. After the inclusive framework was entered into and signed off by all the countries, he made a statement which said, let me be very straight. The policymakers from developing countries are sort of forced to choose between something bad and something worse. Worse is getting nothing and bad is what we are getting. It's very little. You will hear a lot of views from possibly developing countries, developed countries. This is an interesting proposition from one developing, from the economy minister of a developing country. Another point is how the African Tax Administration Forum, it released a press statement. And in that, there were multiple issues. There were certain positives that it highlighted, certain negatives. I just wanted to highlight one point from the negative of what it called for a change. The ATAF called for at least 35% of the residual profit to be allocated to market jurisdiction. However, ATAF is disappointed with the 25% residual profit to market jurisdictions under amounting. So I am not sure if the dust around this point is settled and how countries are going to accept this. Till this gets done, you may have some of these pulls and pushes. One will just have to wait and watch in terms of how it pans out. And I know I'm well beyond my allocated time, so I will very, very quickly wrap up this slide. The UK has had a recent autumn budget, and there is a confirmation that the tax rate is going up from 19% to 25% effective 2023. This is nothing new here. This was on the lines that was proposed earlier. Likewise, Indonesia also had contemplated a reduction of the tax rate from 22 to 20%. It now intends to hold the tax rates at 20%. With that, I will stop this quick summary and I will wait to hear from you in terms of what we should be doing, how we can have this during the subsequent sessions, the amount of depth versus breadth, the coverage that you would like, etc. Thank you for this opportunity. A pleasure to be here.